The crystal champagne flute slipped from Richard Morrison's trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of his penthouse study. 23 years of fatherhood crumbled in that instant, not from the broken glass, but from the manila envelope that lay open before him, its contents spilling a truth so devastating it threatened to destroy everything he thought he knew about love, family, and the daughter he'd raised as his own. Maria Gonzalez had worked as the Morrison family's housekeeper for 15 years, moving through their sprawling Manhattan penthouse like a ghost, to invisible, efficient, and utterly devoted. She'd watched little Sophie Morrison grow from a precocious 8-year-old into the radiant 23-year-old woman she was today. But Maria carried a secret that had eaten at her conscience for over a decade. A secret that would either heal a fractured family or destroy it entirely. Richard Morrison was the kind of man whose name appeared in Forbes magazine and whose charitable donations made headlines. He'd built his tech empire from nothing, transforming a small software company into a billion-dollar corporation. Yet for all his success, the past 5 years had been marked by a growing distance between him and Sophie. A chasm that seemed to widen with each passing day despite his desperate attempts to bridge it. Sophie had always been different, her dark eyes holding depths of wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young, her compassion extending to every stray animal and struggling person she encountered. While her friends from elite private schools spent their trust funds on designer handbags and exotic vacations, Sophie volunteered at homeless shelters and tutored underprivileged children. Richard had attributed her extraordinary empathy to good upbringing, never suspecting the truth that lay buried in Maria's heart. The revelation came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Richard had been working late in his study when he heard Maria sobbing in the hallway. Concerned, he'd found her clutching a faded photograph and a bundle of letters, her usually composed demeanor shattered by grief. "My sister," Maria had whispered, her English broken by emotion. "My Carmen." She would have been 40 today. Richard had never heard Maria mention a sister. In all their years together, she'd shared little about her personal life, maintaining the professional boundary that had made her such an exemplary employee. But grief has a way of dissolving barriers, and that night, Maria's story poured out like water through a broken dam. Carmen Gonzalez had been Maria's younger sister, a vibrant artist who'd come to New York with dreams bigger than her circumstances could support. She'd worked multiple jobs while pursuing her passion, painting murals in community centers and creating art that celebrated their Mexican heritage. But Carmen had also been sick of a rare heart condition that required expensive treatment she couldn't afford. She was so proud, Maria explained, tears streaming down her weathered face. Too proud to ask for help, even from me. She was living in a tiny apartment in Queens, barely making rent, when she met him. The him in question was David Patterson, Richard's former business partner and closest friend. David had discovered Carmen's work at a small gallery in Soho and had been immediately captivated not just by her art, but by her spirit. Their romance had been whirlwind and passionate, but David was already married to Elizabeth, a cold socialite who viewed their marriage as a business arrangement rather than a love story. Carmen had never known about David's marriage until it was too late. By then, she was pregnant and desperately ill, her heart condition worsening with each passing month. David, torn between his secret love and his public life, had promised to leave Elizabeth after the baby was born. But promises, Maria learned, were fragile things in the world of wealthy men with reputations to protect. Carmen died 3 days after Sophie was born, Maria continued, her voice barely a whisper. Her heart just gave out. David, he couldn't take the baby. Elizabeth would have destroyed him if she'd known all about the affair. And me, I was just a maid with no papers, no money. I couldn't raise a child. Richard felt the world tilting around him as understanding dawned. Sophie, he breathed. Maria nodded, pulling out documents that told the rest of the story. David had arranged a private adoption, falsifying records to hide Sophie's true parentage. Richard and his late wife Helen, who had struggled with infertility for years, had been told Sophie was the child of a young woman who'd chosen to give her baby to a loving family. They'd never questioned the story, too grateful for the miracle of finally becoming parents. "I took this job to be near her," Maria confessed. "To watch over my sister's daughter." Mr. David, he helped arrange it, made sure I got hired. He said it was the least he could do. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. David's special interest in Sophie over the years, his generous college fund contributions, his insistence on being her godfather, the way Sophie's artistic talents had emerged so naturally, her intuitive understanding of color and form that had nothing to do with Richard's analytical mind or Helen's practical nature. Richard's first instinct was rage at David for the deception, at Maria for keeping the secret, at himself for being blind to the truth. But as he looked at the photograph Maria held, a picture of Carmen holding newborn Sophie in the hospital, his anger transformed into something more complex. The resemblance was undeniable, but what struck him most was the expression of pure, selfless love on Carmen's face as she gazed at her daughter. The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and agonizing decisions. Richard hired private investigators who confirmed every detail of Maria's story. DNA tests, though unnecessary given the overwhelming evidence, provided final proof that Sophie was indeed Carmen's daughter. But the hardest part wasn't accepting the truth, it was deciding what to do with it. Richard watched Sophie that weekend, seeing her with new eyes. She moved through their home with unconscious grace, painting watercolors in the sunroom that overlooked Central Park. Her latest piece depicted children playing in a garden, their faces radiant with joy. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was filled with the same spirit that had shone through Carmen's work all those years ago. "Dad," Sophie looked up from her canvas, catching him staring. "You've been acting strange lately. Is everything okay?" The word dad hit him like a physical blow. Was he still her father? Did biology matter more than the 23 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, and proud moments at school plays? Did it matter more than the love that had grown between them, imperfect but real? That evening, Richard made his decision. He called Sophie and Maria into his study, the same room where his world had shattered just days before. Sophie sat in the leather chair where she'd done homework as a child, while Maria stood nervously by the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "There's something you both need to know," Richard began, his voice steadier than he felt. He told Sophie everything about Carmen, about David, about the circumstances of her birth and adoption. He watched her face cycle through confusion, shock, and finally, a kind of wondering acceptance. When he finished, the room fell silent except for the distant sounds of traffic far below. Sophie turned to Maria, studying her face with new understanding. "You've been taking care of me my whole life," she said softly. "Not just as a housekeeper, but as family." Maria's composure cracked completely. "You are my blood," she whispered in Spanish, then repeated in English. "Mi sobrina querida, my dear niece." What happened next surprised them both. Sophie stood and walked to Maria, wrapping her arms around the woman who had been a quiet guardian angel throughout her childhood. They held each other and wept for Carmen, for lost time, for the complex love that had sustained them both without either fully understanding it. Richard felt his own eyes filling with tears as he watched them. He had expected Sophie to be angry, to feel betrayed or confused about her identity. Instead, she seemed to be embracing a truth that, on some level, she had always known. "Dad," Sophie said, turning back to Richard. The word came naturally, without hesitation. "This doesn't change anything between us. You raised me. You loved me. You're my father in every way that matters." But it did change things, in the most beautiful way possible. Over the following months, Sophie learned about her mother's heritage, studying Spanish with Maria and exploring the vibrant culture that was part of her birthright. She painted murals in community centers, just as Carmen had done, creating art that bridged worlds and celebrated the power of love to transcend boundaries. Richard, meanwhile, found himself seeing the world through different eyes. He established the Carmen Gonzalez Foundation, providing healthcare and support for immigrants and their families. He regularized Maria's immigration status and insisted she accept the title of family manager rather than housekeeper, a role that better reflected her true position in their lives. David Patterson, when confronted with the truth, broke down completely. His marriage to Elizabeth had ended years earlier, and he had spent decades carrying the guilt of abandoning both Carmen and Sophie. Through tears, he begged forgiveness from both Sophie and Maria, promising to spend whatever time he had left making amends. 6 months later, Richard stood in the same sunroom where he'd first noticed Sophie's artistic gifts, watching her teach painting to a group of children from the local community center. Her laughter filled the space as she helped a little boy mix colors for his masterpiece, her patience infinite and her joy infectious. Maria appeared beside him, carrying a tray of hot chocolate for the children. At 72, she moved a little slower than before, but her eyes held a peace that hadn't been there for decades. "She has Carmen's gift," Maria said, watching Sophie guide another child's brush across the canvas. "But she has your heart, Mr. Richard." "The best of both worlds." Richard smiled, understanding now that families aren't just created by blood or law, but by love, sacrifice, and the daily choice to show up for one another. Sophie would always be Carmen's daughter, inheriting her mother's artistic soul and compassionate spirit. But she was also his daughter, shaped by years of love and guidance that had helped her become the remarkable woman she was today. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating Sophie's face as she worked with the children, Richard felt a profound sense of gratitude. The truth had indeed shattered his world, but from the pieces, something even more beautiful had emerged. A family bound not just by genetics or legal documents, but by understanding, acceptance, and the kind of unconditional love that transcends every barrier. In the end, they had all learned that the most shocking truths aren't always destructive. Sometimes, they're exactly what we need to build something stronger, more honest, and more beautiful than what came before.